I remember the first week of December 1944 as if it were sealed in frost. Novigrad breathed like any ordinary winter city then, slow, smoky, unaware of how close it stood to the edge. From my apartment window above the Volna embankment, I watched barges push through the half-frozen river, their engines coughing into the cold morning air. Schoolchildren built lopsided snowmen in front of the cathedral steps, their laughter echoing between the empty trams. Even the air raid sirens, hollow and distant, had become something like a metronome to our days, annoying, predictable, ignored. But I felt it. A quiet shiver beneath the surface, as if the city were holding its breath. At night, the roads leading west grew strangely deserted. Trucks without markings moved toward the hills of Stary Yar, their headlights covered, engines rumbling like a warning someone forgot to translate. People whispered about new checkpoints, new faces in unfamiliar uniforms, and artillery being hauled through the old vineyards. The newspapers still printed assurances, our lines remain firm, our spirit unbroken. Yet whenever I passed the railway station, I saw families waiting with too many suitcases as if tomorrow might simply vanish. No one admitted it then, but we all sensed something shifting in the snow-heavy air. I certainly did. As a journalist, I had spent the past year reporting on victories that barely existed and losses we were forbidden to name. But now, walking those brittle streets, even I couldn't pretend. Something enormous was coming for us. Something with steel tracks, hunger, and inevitability. We just didn't know that the fate of the entire war would hinge here, in our tired, frost-bitten Novigrad, a place still foolish enough to believe that tomorrow would look like yesterday. The fighting around Novigrad had already carved a year out of my life, though it felt longer, an endless loop of advances that dissolved by morning and retreats disguised as planned repositioning. I had reported from trenches that turned to rivers after every thaw, and from command tents where officers drew arrows on maps with a confidence no one truly felt. What I remember most is the exhaustion in their eyes, a dull, hollow shine that said none of us understood why the city mattered so much, only that it somehow did. Prime Minister Alexei Gromov insisted Novigrad was the heart of our independence. He visited once that autumn, stepping out of a black sedan with an entourage that smelled of new leather and expensive cigarettes. I shook his hand during a staged press moment. His palm was colder than the wind off the Volna. This city stands for all of us, he told me, but his gaze slid past my shoulder, as if he were already imagining the speeches he could give if we somehow survived. Marshal Pavel Chernenko, on the other side, seemed to believe Novigrad was a personal insult engraved on the map. Every intercepted broadcast from his headquarters carried the same message. The Union must prove it could crush any resistance, no matter the cost. To him, the city was not merely a target, it was a test of will. And he had plenty to prove after the blunders earlier in the campaign. Both men, I think now, were trapped by history. Gromov clung to Novigrad because losing it meant losing every promise he'd ever made. Chernenko attacked because he believed that victory here would wash away months of bloody stalemate. Their ambitions knotted together above us like wires pulled too tight, and we, soldiers, families, the city itself, were caught in the tension. By the time December arrived, everyone sensed it. I walked the old marketplace where vendors wrapped their hands in rags to keep warm, and overheard them mutter that if Novigrad fell, the whole region would tilt like an unbalanced table. They weren't wrong. Supply routes, mountain passes, winter airfields, all converged here. If Chernenko took the cathedral square, he'd open a corridor straight to the coast. If Gromov held the line, he could claim the Union's advance had finally broken. What mattered to the city's people, homes, streets, the fragile rhythm of daily life, no longer entered the calculations of the men drawing maps. Only whose flag would rise in the winter light above the cathedral spire. General Vladimir Sedov summoned me to the command bunker 2 days before the siege began. The entrance was hidden beneath the old customs warehouse by the river, its stairwell lit by a single flickering bulb. Inside, the air smelled of damp concrete and cigarette ash. Sedov stood over a table heavy with maps, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the whole front pressed down on him. He told me, quietly as though embarrassed, that the city was ready. Bridges mined, catacombs charted, defensive lines reinforced by volunteers from the Order of Tsarnitsa. We can hold, he insisted, tracing thick arrows across the map. At least until reinforcements arrive. Even then I sensed he didn't believe his own words. The Tsarnitsa boys were barely trained, armed with mismatched rifles and a kind of feverish patriotism that burned bright only until the first shells landed. Yet in the bunker, with the maps glowing under the lamps, everything looked neat, orderly, winnable. It was an illusion I wanted to believe. I left the bunker with a strange lightness, almost hope, but it lasted only until the first hours of the siege. Chernenko's forces closed the encirclement around Novigrad with terrifying speed, far faster than our intelligence had warned. Southern communications collapsed before noon. The field radios spat nothing but static. I tried to reach the press office near the Copper Bridge, but the streets were already flooding with retreating units, their formation broken, their faces pale with the shock of seeing how close the enemy had come. Then came the explosion, one that shook the cathedral windows and sent a column of smoke spiraling into the pale sky. Captain Georgy Drozdov, misreading a garbled order, detonated the charges beneath the Copper Bridge too early. He thought he was sealing the enemy out. Instead, he trapped nearly 200 of our own troops on the far bank. When I reached the embankment, I saw soldiers screaming across the widening gap, their shouts lost beneath the crackle of burning timbers. In that moment, every confident arrow on Sadov's map evaporated from my memory. The city we thought we had prepared was already slipping from our grasp, becoming a trap with walls of fire and ice. The fighting began at the warehouses on the western edge, grimy brick boxes that had always smelled of grain and diesel. I was there when the first shells landed, turning the loading docks into splintered teeth. At sunrise the next day, the battle had already crawled inward, as if the city were being swallowed from the outside. The tram depot fell before noon. By evening, smoke poured from the windows of the old brickworks. Every place I thought too ordinary to die was suddenly a front line. Chernenko's tactics shifted like weather. First came the rolling barrages, hour-long thunder that shook dust from my ceiling and left my ears humming. Then sudden assaults, sharp, fast, terrifying, enemies appearing out of the fog like figures stepping through torn fabric. After that, long silences that made every breath feel stolen. Sadov tried to respond, but all he had left were the Tsarnitsa volunteers and fragments of battalions already bleeding from earlier clashes. He sent them in anyway. "Buy me time," he whispered once, rubbing his temples. Time was the only currency we had left, and we spent it too quickly. The city changed with each passing day. Streets that once echoed with trolley bells became kill corridors lined with shattered windows and overturned buses. The Volna River carried more debris than water, broken beams, crates, and once tragically a child's red sled. Snow turned to a brown crust that crunched underfoot like dried leaves. Everywhere I went, I saw the same blank look on soldiers' faces, disbelief that we were fighting block by block for places that hadn't mattered a week earlier. One afternoon, I followed a platoon through an elementary school. The hallways were filled with torn textbooks and broken crayons, crushed by boot prints. On the roof, a sniper team tried to hold back an advance from the northern tracks. I lay beside them, feeling the tremble of each shot ripple through my ribs. When the enemy finally pushed us off the building, we escaped down the fire escape just as the top floor collapsed in a plume of smoke and chalk dust. By then, every corner of Novigrad had become a battlefield. Apartments, rooftops, playgrounds, each turned into a brief, violent story before being abandoned. And as I moved through the ruins with my notebook tucked under my coat, a terrible truth settled over me: the city was no longer a place. It was a grinder made of stone and snow, chewing through everything we still dared to call ours. The siege pressed us all underground. Basements that once stored potatoes and winter coats became our homes, our hospitals, and our hiding places. Days blurred in the dim yellow glow of candles, the air heavy with dust and breath. I spent hours crouched beside families who whispered stories to keep their children calm while artillery thudded overhead. In those cramped rooms, every sound was magnified: the rattle of pipes, the distant crack of rifles, the shuffle of someone shifting to make space for another frozen stranger. Dr. Elena Kramskaya worked in the basement of school number 12, where desks had been pushed aside to make room for blankets and bundles of gauze. I visited her often, carrying notes from the front or just offering a spare pair of gloves. She treated the wounded on the cold floor, her hands trembling only when she washed the blood from them in a metal basin. Once I saw her use a door torn from its hinges as a stretcher. She looked at me and whispered, "We're building a hospital out of ruins." Above us the city groaned. Retired tram conductor Ilya Ryabinin wandered from shelter to shelter searching for batteries. He kept an old radio wrapped in cloth, convinced that one day it would crackle with news of relief forces. Each night he turned its dial slowly, hoping for a voice he recognized. I often sat beside him, listening to the static like prayer. Then there was Kirill Yeroshenko, the frontline cameraman assigned to capture the glorious defense of Novigrad. He found me near the burned-out market one morning, his camera hanging from his neck like a weight he could no longer carry. "They wanted heroism," he muttered, "but all I see is fear." I followed him as he filmed nurses dragging wounded men through snow, mothers clutching empty pails at the last working well, soldiers crouched behind barricades whispering prayers through chattering teeth. In his lens, the city's suffering became undeniable, an archive of despair that none of us had asked to witness. Sometimes I caught him crying behind the viewfinder. Not loud sobs, just silent tears freezing on his cheeks. He didn't yet know that his images would survive long after the rest of us were gone. By the time the final assault crept toward Stary Yar, the city's heartbeat had turned faint and irregular, like a dying animal's last tremor. I felt it as I climbed the blasted stairs of the courthouse, each step coated with ash, each landing echoing with distant gunfire. News traveled through Novigrad not by radio anymore but by whispers. Chernenko had ordered the push that would decide everything. Sadov's lines had buckled. Ammunition was gone. The Tsarnitsa volunteers, once bright-eyed, now clutched empty rifles and stared at the snow as if answers might appear there. When the northern defenses collapsed, I ran with a cluster of civilians toward the old vineyard path. A shell struck somewhere behind us and the blast threw me to my knees. For a moment I lay stunned, listening to the whine of ricochets and the thin, panicked cries of people scattering like frightened birds. Above the rooftops, smoke curled into the cold sky in thick blue coils. Somewhere in that haze, the last defenders were making their stand, not out of loyalty to Gromov or the promises printed in newspapers, but because there was nowhere left to retreat. By mid-morning, the echoes of rifle fire near the cathedral faded into a kind of dreadful quiet. I crossed the square cautiously, stepping over shattered stained-glass panels glittering like spilled jewels. A wounded lieutenant leaned against the toppled statue, his breath fogging in short bursts. He looked at me and said, "It's over. We're out of shells. Out of men." His voice carried no anger, only the resignation of someone who had seen an hour stretch into a lifetime. At noon the Union flag rose above the cathedral spire. The surviving bells, cracked but stubborn, swayed in the wind as if mourning. Half the bridges were gone. The historic center smoldered in heaps of charred beams. Civilians wandered through the ruins in dazed silence, counting the missing by memory alone. I stood on the riverbank watching the Volna carry pieces of our city downstream, fragments of homes, doors, beams, a single boot. Chernenko claimed a decisive foothold. Gromov fled into exile, already a ghost in foreign newspapers. But the victory tasted like frostbitten air, cold, brittle, and hollow. Even the soldiers who marched in with triumph in their orders avoided meeting our eyes. It sounded, I thought, like footsteps echoing through an empty cathedral. In the months after the siege, Novigrad no longer felt like a city but a wound stitched too quickly. The authorities arrived in immaculate uniforms, stepping over scorched cobblestones as if they feared getting dust on their boots. They called us heroes of an unbreakable chapter, though they spoke the words with the hollow confidence of men who had never seen a basement surgery or heard a child cry for water at dawn. They rebuilt the main avenues first, laying fresh stone over the places where cellars still held the smell of smoke and rot. The official reports mentioned courage, sacrifice, unity, but never the flooded catacombs where dozens suffocated, or the soldiers shot for retreating, or the copper bridge burned by our own mistake. People walked quieter that year. Some out of grief, others out of caution. I carried my notebook everywhere though I wrote little. What could I add to the ashes? Even the Volna moved slower, thick with silt and memory. I often stopped on the embankment, imagining the faces of those swept away in the river current, wondering if history would ever remember their names. Decades later, when the city felt whole again, or at least pretended to, I found myself in a dusty archive room beneath the new municipal hall. A caretaker handed me a battered suitcase they'd uncovered during renovations. Inside lay Kirill Yeroshenko's film reels, brittle, silent, gray with age. I threaded the first reel into an old projector, and suddenly the room filled with ghosts. Nurses dragging wounded men across snow. Children waiting in a line that stretched around a bombed-out bakery. Elders staring at the burning arches of a collapsed bridge. Kirill had filmed everything we tried to forget. A documentary crew assembled soon after, eager to turn the footage into something people could finally watch without flinching. They titled it The Streets of Budapest, Rare Footage of a Forgotten Carnage. The name confused many, but I understood the symbolism. Every city carries its own Budapest, its own silent suffering, its own broken heart tucked beneath fresh paint and patriotic slogans. When the film premiered, I sat in the back row, listening to the audience gasp at moments I had lived through. Some wept, others looked away. As the final frame lingered, a mother clutching a soot-stained blanket, I felt a weight settle inside me. If history teaches at such a monstrous cost, why do we keep offering blood as tuition? I still ask myself that question whenever winter returns.